Hello poker players, this is Steve Subbrady again. Today we will find out how to play pocket jacks, the bane of many recreational players. Actually, I love pocket jacks. I would love to play an online Zoom game where I had pocket jacks every hand. I'd win a fortune. Ah well, we can only dream. Anyway, I will show you how to play pocket jacks in this lecture, both in low stakes cash games and in tournaments. Pause. So let's get started. I have heard many players quote this classic advice. There are 3 ways to play pocket jacks, and they are all wrong. I'm not sure who originated this line, but it might have been Joshua Hodge in 2011. But there seems to be a common attitude among non-professionals about playing pocket jacks, a sense of foreboding that can distort the way many recreational players play them. We can even see this in the classic 1998 film Rounders.
Jacks? What did you think he had? Does he look like a man beaten by jacks?
Jacks are a monster compared to the crap you play, Tacky.
Fuck you. Fuck you.
Fuck me. Fuck you.
In reality, playing pocket jacks is straightforward in most situations, but there is no single correct way to play them, or any other hand for that matter. I will show you in this video the principles behind playing them well. First, let's summarize some of the simple math related to pocket jacks. We will be dealt pocket jacks 0.45% of the time. This is about 1 time in 220 hands. So there's a 1.35% chance for the next player behind us to get pocket aces, kings, or queens. So we should not be unduly worried that our pocket jacks will be crushed by our lefty. But we do need to consider how many players are behind us. When we are under the gun 8-handed, there are 7 players behind us. So there's a 9.5% chance that one of them has a larger pair. This drops to only 4% when we are in the cutoff and 2.7% when we are in the button. These odds are not a good reason for paranoia. Let's just act now and see what happens later. The flop brings a new challenge to our pocket jacks. 57% of the time, the flop will bring an overcard, although sometimes that overcard will come with a flop set for us. We can use Flopzilla to estimate the chances that a villain will flop top pair when an overcard flops, summarized in this table. Depending on the calling range of the villain, an ace will pair the villain less than a quarter of the time, using the Flopzilla no limit ranges, but eliminating the aces, kings, and queens in the villain's range. But this drops to about 18% for a king or a queen. I suspect that a typical low-stakes villain or tournament player will call our pre-flop raise with more aces than the Flopzilla range recommends, so I would bump up the ace pairs to maybe 30% or so. So we should not fear a king or a queen on a raised flop. Even an ace should not automatically induce a cringe. We should also be more cautious when our 3-bet is called with, say, an 8% range. Now an overcard is more likely to pair the villain. An overpair is also more likely, since some players will just flat a 3-bet with queens, kings, and aces. We must also be more cautious in multi-way pots. The more villains in the pot, the more likely at least one of them has paired an overcard. Essentially, 2 villains doubles the chances for an overpair. But our odds are still pretty good. The lesson here is simple. We should not get too worried about a single overcard unless our opponent lets us know we're behind, which is how low stakes players usually play. There are several key factors that affect our pocket jack strategy. Our first consideration is our table position. Suppose we use GTO Wizard to model a 9-handed cash game with 100 big blind stacks and the NL50 rake structure. The EV for opening jacks under the gun is 0.10 big blinds, shown here. So opening under the gun to 2.5 big blinds has a 0.1 big blind expected value in the GTO game. We can run this model for each table position shown here. We can see that as our table position improves, our expectation also improves. This is because there are fewer players behind us that can wake up with a bigger pair, and because our average post-flop position also improves as our own position improves. Here we can see that our EV for opening in a 6-max game is the same as in the 9-max game after the first 3 players have folded. So, however many players are in our game, our position is determined by the number of players we are to the right of the small blind. So we can conclude from these GTO Wizard models that we should always open with pocket jacks. What do we do with limpers ahead of us? My Holy Grail strategy states that we should usually ignore the limpers in a soft cash game or in a tournament. So we should always raise limpers when we have pocket jacks, unless we think the initial limper is a malicious limper trying to trap with a larger pair. Many players seem to have an obsession with rake. Rake is just the price we must pay in order to have a card room to play in. Rake is fairly consistent in Las Vegas at 10%, with the maximum being $5 or $6. So for a 1-3 game, the cap is about 2 big blinds. For a 3-5 game, this cap is about 1 big blind. But some card rooms in the world have much higher rake structures than this. GTO Wizard uses a 5% rake with various caps. My baseline strategy is built on the NL50 rake model, which uses a 4 big blind cap. This is slower than Vegas 1-3 or 2-5, but with a higher cap. We can model the effect of this rake has on our pocket jacks using GTO Wizard. We can then compare our baseline NL50 rake structure to the more severe NL50 GG rake structure, which is capped at 8 big blinds. We can see that we should always be opening with jacks, even with the more severe rake structure. And of course, these EVs are based on GTO strong opponents. If we are playing in a low stakes, high rake card room, our EV for playing jacks should even be better. The NL500 rake structure is capped at 0.6 big blinds, which is much milder than the Vegas low stakes games. And we can see that we should always be opening jacks even for this. Basically, we shouldn't be worried about the rake when we play pocket jacks. Another possible factor in playing pocket jacks is the effective stack size. Some players believe we need a certain stack size in order to open with pocket jacks, but this isn't true in a cash game, especially in a low stakes cash game with recreational players. It's also not true in a tournament, though our play does change somewhat with stacks below about 20 big blinds. This table summarizes the expected value of opening with pocket jacks in a 6-max cash game with various stack sizes. We can see that our EV does depend on the effective stacks, generally getting larger with smaller stacks, especially in early position. Nevertheless, it's clear from this model that we always have significant positive EV for playing pocket jacks with any stack size and from any position. Playing jacks against a pre-flop raiser is much more complex than opening. The raise can come from any place ahead of us and from any type of player. On the bright side, we will usually have position if we 3-bet. This table summarizes the EV for 3-betting after an open, and this is the color key for those GTO mixed strategies. For example, the solution when we face an under-the-gun open is to 3-bet or fold when we are in the cutoff or earlier. We can see that these are all neutral value decisions, so we could choose to always fold jacks to an opener until we reach the button. But this is a strategy that is too severe, at least against real players. They tend to open too tightly, which nudges us towards folding, but they tend to play poorly post-flop, which nudges us back towards 3-betting. This is an exploitive decision we must make based on our reads of Mr. Opener. When we are on the button, we should usually 3-bet or flat, shown in green here. These EVs are also usually positive in a low-stakes cash game or tournament, where our typical opponents are exploitable post-flop. We should call or 3-bet based on our reads. We also have situations in which we should always 3-bet against a GTO opener, shown in blue here. So my baseline strategy is to 3-bet from the button and blinds no matter where the open came from, unless we know Mr. Opener is very passive with a very tight opening range. I would rarely 3-bet against an early position opener in a low stakes cash game unless he's an aggressive opener who I can outplay post-flop. but I would 3-bet them in a tournament. GTO Wizard has no flatting range for these early position opens, but that's against a GTO strong opponent. In a real game, I think flatting an early position opener is okay in some cases, depending on the villain. So our 3-bet strategy is more complex than our opening strategy. Although we can always choose to 3-bet against a GTO open, we should be more cautious if Mr. Opener is passive. We might fold our neutral and near neutral combos unless we think we can outplay him post-flop when he misses. Another situation should be mentioned here, and that is we need to determine what to do when there's an opener plus a caller. This is something we can't model for every situation, but suppose the low jack opens to 2.5 big blinds and the button flats. The small blind GTO solution is a mixed strategy 3-bet or flat with 1.24 big blind expected value, which is higher than the 0.45 big blind expected value without the button caller. So we can find the same conclusions with an open from any other position. So my advice is that we can 3-bet after an open plus caller just as we would with an opener, but in fact we might even be able to 3-bet an open plus call in every position, even in a low stakes Vegas cash game. Post-flop strategy can be trickier than pre-flop strategy. Simply speaking, our post-flop goal is to win the maximum when we are ahead while losing the minimum when we are beaten. That's easier said than done. Our post-flop strategy is very complex, so I will only discuss two situations here. The first situation is on the flop with no overcards. The low jack has opened to 2.5 big blinds in a 1-3 Vegas cash game. On the button, we 3-bet to 7.5 big blinds. The flop is 10-8-6 rainbow, and the villain checks to us. It's unlikely the villain has a larger pair than ours, but he could have a set. A straight with 7-9 suited is also unlikely. My default action in this situation against these players is to c-bet about half pot. Villains tend to be elastic, so betting smaller is not usually any better. Betting larger, like full pot, makes it more likely we will be called only by better hands. GTO Wizard shows this as a mixed strategy, c-bet or check. But you can see that these EVs are nearly the same. But this is when we face a GTO strong villain. Against a much weaker villain, we want to make the most exploitive play, which usually amounts to making the more aggressive play, as long as we don't get stupid about it. We want to put some pressure on the villain with the expectation that he will make mistakes. That's the very definition of exploitation. Whether we make a half pot bet or a larger bet will be based on our read. Suppose we bet half pot and the villain calls. The turn is a deuce and the villain checks again. GTO Wizard still recommends a mixed strategy, but now it's about 80% bet and 20% check. The villain checked to us again, which reduces the chances that he has a set or a straight. He didn't check raise the flop, so he also is unlikely to have a larger pair. So we should bet again, and my default is a half pot bet again. In this case, GTO Wizard suggests 3/4 pot, but the EVs are all close to the same thing. Our decision should be based on our reads again. The basic idea here is that we must read the board and our opponent. If we believe the villain is a weak player, we should generally believe what his actions tell us. Most low stakes players let us know the strength of their hand by the turn, if not earlier. GTO Wizard can be useful for investigating these various flops with and without overcards. Usually we will find that many of the actions have similar EVs. Even when GTO Wizard recommends one of them, reads are critical in a real game. There are many ways to play pocket jacks incorrectly, with varying degrees of damage done. Perhaps the most expensive type of error is to play our jacks too aggressively. And the most obvious way players do that is to bet too large pre-flop. I have often seen a player open to 8 10 big blinds, only to hear someone say he must have jacks. Large opens and raises tend to give away the strength of our hand, which helps our opponents play more perfectly. For example, they can fold their weak combos that they might have played, which is potential profit, out the window. Calling the villain's big bet also makes bluffing easier for us when an overcard hits. Overbetting is bad for the villain, any way you look at it. Another major error is to c-bet too large. When there is no overcard, Mr. Jacks is prone to bet large, pot or better for example, for fear that the next card will be an overcard. I've even seen some players jam in this situation. There are two main reasons why this is bad strategy. First, we lose the maximum when we are beaten, and second, we win the minimum when the opponent would have called a smaller bet with a weaker hand. This is not the way to maximize our profit. Another big error is to ignore what the villain is telling us by his actions. If he is telling us he has a big hand, we should usually believe him. For example, when an ace flops and the villain check raises, we should usually believe he has us beat. We might call one street to keep him honest, but don't get married to your hand. It's just jacks. Finally, we should not stack off with a 100 big blind stack or larger. In fact, we should be very leery of stacking off even 50 big blinds. Suppose we 3-bet a 4 big blind open to 12 big blinds, and the villain jams. He has a 50 big blind stack. This is a call against Mr. GTO, but we should be much more cautious against most low-stakes cash game players. Playing our jacks too passively is also a big error, but it tends to cost us less money than playing too aggressively. One common mistake is to limp with our jacks. Pocket jacks is a value hand that should always be opened, and we should always raise limpers. Limping misses value from those worst combos that would call a standard raise. The GTO wizard charts we saw earlier should convince you of that. Another mistake is to not 3-bet a pre-flop raise from an average player. By average, I mean we should 3-bet anyone who is not opening with a very tight range, a rock. We should also 3-bet the proper amount. 3x is a standard 3-bet size when we are not in the blinds and when the stacks are large enough. Betting too small gives the villain better odds to play with us, especially better odds for set minding. We should nearly always c-bet when the flop is all undercards. Yes, a set is always possible, but if we bet properly pre-flop, we should not worry about the sets until the villain tells us otherwise. One exception might be a flop seen by 3 or more players. Similarly, always checking behind when an overcard flops is a mistake. We should usually c-bet in a heads-up flop when a queen or king flops. Tournament strategy for playing jacks is very similar to cash game strategy until we drop below about 20 big blind effective stacks. This table summarizes the EV for opening jacks in a tournament. Let's look at the EV for opening with 100 stacks. We can see that our EV is much higher in a tournament than in a cash game. This is because the tournament antes increase the initial amount that we can win. These are all pure strategy opens except for the small blind, which is a mixed strategy open or call. This is the same conclusion for all large stack situations, which is 20 stacks and higher. Again, with the exception of the small blind, the GTO strategy is to always open with jacks. From the small blind, we can open or flat as a mixed strategy, but I recommend we always open in a real tournament. Our strategy with small stacks is more complex. In the transition zone, which is between about 10 and 20 big blinds, we often have a mixed strategy with the same EV for opening or limping. In a real tournament, we should usually just open because we hate to limp, and we are happy to jam over any raise. But when our effective stacks drop to 10 big blinds or so, we should generally just jam in a real tournament, even though GTO Wizard has some of these as mixed strategies. 3-bet strategies with jacks is even more complex. When our stacks are large enough and the open is normal, we can always 3-bet. though sometimes GTO Wizard might have this as a mixed strategy, 3-bet or flat. But when the SPR would drop below about 1.0, we should usually just jam. For example, after a 2 big blind open, our 3-bet from the button should be 6 big blinds. The pot would then be about 14 big blinds if the villain calls. So if our stack is smaller than about 20 big blinds, we should usually just jam over the open. In a real tournament, our jam exerts considerable chip utility pressure over the villain, who will often call more tightly than a GTO villain would call. Let's look at a few examples. We are playing in an 8-handed Las Vegas 1-3 game, and we have our pocket jacks under the gun. Based on our strategy, this is an easy open. Our standard here for this game is $12, which is 4 big blinds, and that's what we do. We bet $12. Then it folds around to the big blind who calls. The flop is ace, 10, 3 with 2 spades, and the villain checks. It's on us. What should we do here? We can either check or bet here, but I prefer to bet against a player who plays poorly post-flop. So I bet $15, which is 5 big blinds, and Mr. Lag calls. The turn is another 3 pairing the board, and the villain checks again. And it's on us again. This 3 is unlikely to change my situation, but betting now would allow the villain to get away from the hand when he has a worse combo. Checking behind allows me to keep the pot small when he does have an ace and call most river bets, including bluffs. So I check behind. The river is the queen of clubs, and the villain bets $30, which is a little bit larger than half pot. My purpose for checking behind on the turn was to induce a bluff from a weak player, so I call. The villain had king 10 suited, and I took down the pot, the $110 pot. This is a case of playing somewhat cautiously once we see a bad flop. Checking the turn not only keeps the pot small when I am behind, but induces a bluff or a thin value bet when I am ahead. This time we are playing in a 9-handed Las Vegas 1-2 game a couple of years ago, and we are on the button with jacks. 2 players limp, and the loose aggressive player in the cutoff raises to $15. What should we do? We can't exactly model this scenario with GTO Wizard because of the limpers, but if we ignore the limpers and have the cutoff open, our GTO response would be a pure strategy 3-bet with a large 2.8 big blind expected value. If we have the low jack open and the cutoff 3-bet, our GTO response would be a mixed strategy 4-bet or fold with 0 big blinds expected value. In any case, I elect to 3-bet to $40. Everybody folds except the lag who calls. The flop is 9-7-7 with 2 hearts, and the villain donks for $40. What should we do now? A donk bet is usually a made hand, but sometimes a draw. He could have an overpair and doesn't want to give me a free card, or he could have a heart draw and wants me to fold my missed flops. I elect to raise small, and the villain jams. I have $300 behind, and the actual pot is about $540. So I'm getting about 1.8 to 1 pot odds, so we need to win about a third of the time to make our call justifiable. He could have 10s, which would be good, or queens, kings, or aces, which would be bad. He would likely have aces or kings less often than queens, 10s, or jacks, but against this discounted range, we are likely to be an underdog. Finally, he could have a flush draw or even pocket 8s. Anyway, I judge that this is a close decision. The villain appears to be polarized. He's either bluffing or he's telling us that he thinks he is ahead. An overbet semi-bluff is unlikely from a typical 1-2 Vegas player, but from a lag, it's more likely. This is a difficult decision, but we should usually believe what any Vegas low-stakes villain is telling us. So I decide to fold. I did lose some chips, but I didn't stack off. The villain doesn't show, but tells me later he had queens. Should I believe him? This time we are in the small blind in a Las Vegas 1-3 cash game. A loose, aggressive player in the low jack opens at $10 and it folds to me in the small blind. This is a GTO Wizard mixed strategy 3-bet or call with an expectation of 0.45 big blinds. The GTO 3-bet size is 11 big blinds after a 2.5 big blind open. So this is a large 4.4 times 3-bet, since we will be out of position if the villain calls our 3-bet. Since the villain is a lag, I don't expect him to be opening tightly, so I opt for the 3-bet, but to only $35. The big blind folds and the lag calls. The flop is 10, 9, 8 with 2 diamonds, and the action is on us. GTO Wizard has this as a mixed strategy, 40% bet or 60% check. But the EVs for most of these options is nearly the same, so our decision should be based on an exploitive decision. I bet $30 and the villain calls. The turn is an offsuit 6 and the action is on us. This card completes a straight if the villain has an 8, which I think is unlikely. So we still have an overpair. GTO Wizard has this as a mixed strategy, bet or check, with about 90% checking. But again, the EV for checking, betting 1/3 pot, or betting half pot are nearly the same. So we have another exploitive judgment call in a real small stakes game with weak villains. I elect to c-bet again, this time to $60, which is just under half pot. And the villain calls again. The river is a true blank and the action is on us. GTO has this as a pure strategy check, and the EV for making a very small bet is not close. I judge that against this particular villain, I should check in order to give him a chance to make a mistake. So I check here. The villain makes a $100 bet into the $250 pot, and the action is on me. GTO Wizard has this as a mixed strategy call or fold, so our decision should be an exploitive one based on our reads. Since the villain is a lag, I think he bluffs more often than most 1-3 players, so I call. He shows top pair, top kicker, and I win the $450 pot. The villain never showed any post-flop aggression until the end, so c-betting twice against a weak player seems like a good exploitive strategy. Check calling on the river provides an aggressive player an opportunity to bluff, especially since most of the draws fail to materialize. A version of this lecture was presented at the Las Vegas Wednesday Poker Discussion Group in May 2024. You can join us every Wednesday at Tommy Rockers, and you can join our Facebook group where you can find out about our next meeting. See you later.